Shame would be the belief that either you're not good enough or you're too much of something. Shame is the urge to hide something about who we are or what we've gone through. The societal programming suggests that men should only be involved in about half of the human experience. When that voice of shame shows up, my job is to soften to it and to create a space for it. I used to think a man was someone who was afraid of nothing around them. Now I think a man is somebody who's afraid of nothing within them.
Hi, and welcome to the Living Richly podcast. We're so glad to have you here with us today. We're so excited to have with us special guest Kelly Flanagan returning with us. Hey, Kelly, how you doing?
Great. It's great to be back, guys.
We are going to be continuing our series on mindful masculinity and zeroing in on the topic of shame, which is one that I think for a lot of guys pretty difficult to have a conversation about.
100%. And Kelly, again, we had such a great conversation with you first time you were on the show. Thank you so much for carving out the time to come back and be on the show again. It's always good when people come back, means they enjoyed themselves the first time, right? But you've authored a number of great books. One being a book that's deeply influenced both Rob and I, and actually the entire Living Richly Nation, because it's the most referred book. We tell everybody, if you want to start this journey of owning your worthiness and overcoming shame, you got to read this book. But you've written Loveable, you've written True Companions, The Unhiding of Elijah Campbell. You're currently working on your latest book called OpenHearted, all of which explores some pretty deep shit, like some pretty deep subjects and some pretty complicated, emotional landscapes that for a lot of people make them uncomfortable, but I think especially for men. What drives your passion to do that?
Well, it wasn't always that way. I was a clinical psychologist in training at Penn State in maybe 2000, 2001. And a local therapist sent out a notice to our entire graduate class. Basically, hey, I want to offer group therapy to all of you. Get into your stuff, figure it out now. I ignored that announcement like the plague. And
like what could go wrong, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. No, I'm okay. That's why I'm going to become a therapist. I'm helping everybody else out who's not okay, right? And so my supervisor, maybe like a month later, pushed back on me. And she said, you really should get back to him and get into that group. Mm-hmm. I put it off for a couple more days. I call him up. He says, Kelly, great. I'm glad you want to be in the group. The only problem is you're the only one that's called me back. Right. So this is like the dirty little secret of the therapeutic community. We love helping other people with their stuff.
Yeah.
But we don't tend to love looking at our own stuff. So I persisted in that for another 7 or 8 years. And by the time we got to 2007, 2008, I was clinically depressed. I was burning out my marriage. I could see the ways that I was passing my own pain onto my children. I had two boys at that point by 2009. And I knew I needed to do something different. And I made the shift. It was actually the New Year's Eve going into 2008. I said, I'm done reading books. I'm done trying to fix things. I'm going to start to practice all the things I've been reading about mindfulness, meditation, contemplative prayer. I'm going to learn how to be with myself and go on the inner journey. And this is what you find out in that part of it, is that the real freedom comes from the inner work, not from anything you do to manage the outside. So that's I want to go deeper and deeper into the inner work and find greater and greater freedom in that.
We're grateful that you have, because the stuff that has come out of that work for you in the sharing. And I know that in many of your books, there's a lot of your own story is woven into them. We've talked about Loveable, how impactful that's been for us. I remember when The Unhiding came out, The Unhiding of Elijah Campbell. That was one of the first books in a long time where, as I got to the end of that book, I felt the tears flowing, and it really did strike me emotionally, feeling Elijah's story and the journey that he goes flows through. You really have shown that. Shame is a big component of is a theme in a lot of the story that you tell. Talk to us a little bit about the challenges of theme, the challenge of shame, the challenges of how that shows up. In particular, our topic today around mindful masculinity. So with men, talk to us about shame and men.
I think shame shows up as a belief. And if you had to sort of distill it down, shame would be the belief that either you're not good enough or you're too much of something. So the first time I encountered my shame was at a workshop where they forced us to answer the question, I'm not blank enough, right? I'm not blank enough. And the answer that came to my mind was interesting. I'm not interesting enough. So you can fill in, and I'm too verbose, all the things. And so in belief form, I think that's how you can start to sort of hone in on it a little bit.
So that's just a bit of a mind blown moment when you said that. Both of us like mic drop, just because shame, I've often heard it defined it myself in my work with leaders and helping them overcome it as not believing that you're not enough, that somehow you're deficient, that you're flawed, that you're different from everybody else. But when you said that you're too much of something, oh my God, did that ever resonate? I've never heard it put that way. And I could probably point to a bunch of areas in my life where I have felt like I'm too much of something, and that sometimes has led to lots of change.
So I looked at you. I know exactly what you're thinking. Clearly, I didn't.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about a good friend of ours, psychologist Matthew Rippey-Young, who he did an episode with us, and he made a statement in there, if you recall, where he said, "I'm too much, but not enough."
Oh yeah.
Right. Remember that frame, and that's how he was feeling. He was showing up in his relationships. I'm too much, but not enough.
And I would just say that too much is just one of those sort of shadows that shame hides out in. It's just a little more cleverly disguised form of it. And I mean, if you want to talk about a common one for guys, how about this one? I'm too sensitive. I'm too sensitive. I'm not tough enough. I'm not thick-skinned enough. I'm not hard-shelled enough. So yeah, I think too much is one we want to keep an eye out for as well.
Yeah. 100%.
That belief can show up in various thought forms, but one of the things I will often say to folks is, if you, in fact, I'll have someone come up to me after any given talk and say, I just really don't feel like I have any shame at all. And I'll say, have you ever felt the urge to hide anything about yourself or your story? Well, yeah, that's shame. Shame is the urge to hide something about who we are or what we've gone through, because we believe it's broken and it's deficient. And if people find out about it, we'll be left alone and we won't belong, essentially. So,
right.
So there's that belief form of it, shows up in various thought forms, but then in terms of inner urge, it shows up as that urge to hide.
Yeah, that's so powerful. I mean, we've been talking a lot about this topic of mindful masculinity, and one of the ways that we've approached it is when we define toxic masculinity. What does that look like? Well, of course, there's the extreme versions of it. There's misogyny, there's aggression, there's violence, there's rage, all the things that we would typically throw into that category. But then there's the toxicity of not being able to express yourself, of feeling like you've got to have it all together all the time, that you have to be that provider. We've talked about some of the archetypes so far that we've covered are the lone wolf, right? And how often the lone wolf becomes a lonely wolf. And we've talked about the stoic, and how there's great benefit to actually both those archetypes, but taken too far, then the stoic gets it's like he's wearing an emotional straitjacket, doesn't know how to express himself specifically. So with the programming, you've been doing this work a long time and you're a dude, so you've got like a whole lifetime of experience. How does the societal programming about how a man should show up contribute to those deep feelings of shame?
I think what you just sort of touched on is that the societal programming suggests that men should only be involved in about half of the human experience. That men should be tough, strong, resilient, and then any experience that is opposed to that, all the other half of the human experience, men should push away and resist. So feeling fragile, uncertain, tender, sensitive, insecure at times, that these are sort of experiences that don't belong in the masculine experience. The problem is that you can't push anything away, you can only push it down. right? And so when you start to push that down, it's still in there, that part of the human experience, but now you're invested in hiding the fact that it's in there. And now you're in the shame cycle. Now you're starting to hide that, oh, by the way, I'm not 50% of a human. I'm a whole human. And, but I'm a man, so I'm not allowed to be wholly human. Right?
Yeah.
So I think society does send that message, which is, you talk about the flip side of toxic masculinity, is that then a man goes around thinking all those things that are not good, those are a woman's territory. Right. And so now a woman is by definition something less than, something shameful, something fragile, something weak, something to be judged. And so a big part of the process is just embracing that both genders carry around the whole human experience, and we need to learn how to be open to it.
What we love about, I love that, and the notion of, you're right, when we're only seeing that half part, of course we're now reflecting that onto the other sex, and we're seeing then it's the opposite of that. What we've really tried to do through this series of, and why we're calling it the Mindful Masculinity, is we're inviting people into conversation. We had right out of the gate, we had people that were very critical, had some very interesting comments when we used the language of toxic masculinity, where again, there's almost this pushback today from people saying enough of the woke culture or whatever, right? And they would push back and would, made these statements.
Well, one of the statements, Kelly, was that a fellow posted on LinkedIn when we shared out the first episode where we talked about why we were so passionate about this subject, and he made the statement that vulnerability is for women, and you two are contributing to everything that makes men weak. Right. And so
it fits right into the context of that.
Yeah, 100%. Sure.
My post on Substack this week was titled "Vulnerability Isn't a Glitch, It's a Guide."
I saw that. Yeah.
Right? That it's part of the human condition. And when you feel vulnerability, it's just telling you about what matters to you, and it would hurt to not have it. Right. So when you feel vulnerable about a person, right, it's telling you that you really love them because you're wondering what's going to happen when they really see you. When you feel vulnerable about your life, it's telling you love your life because you're afraid of anything that might change it or end it. So vulnerability is just a tool to understand what really matters to us.
Oh, I love that.
You in Loveable, you really do frame the notion that we have to start with the loving ourselves, accepting ourselves, the worthiness from within. We call it now, we use the language of radical self-acceptance. What are some of the ways that shame blocks people from the ability to do that?
I think the short way to say it is that shame is sort of intertwined with the sense that our worthiness is conditional upon our performance and what we do, and how we act. One of the stories that I now understand through the inner journey, and it's just such a subtle story, but I offer it up as a way for folks to get connected with their own stories and the subtleties of how we learn that our worthiness is conditional on what we do. So I'm in kindergarten, and as the legend goes, my first season of soccer, I stand in the middle of the field and I turn like I'm on a turntable. Right. I don't even follow the roaming pack of kids and I just stand in the middle of the field and turn and watch. And this apparently was pretty humiliating to some family members of mine who were excellent athletes in their day and age. And, but then near the end of the season, I started to, apparently I'd been like doing the geometry and going, well, if you run straight to that point, you'll get there first, that sort of, and I started to actually perform. And, at the end of the season, of his own goodwill, my coach brought over a trophy for me and brought it to my house, had it made himself. It said most improved player. And one of the very first memories of my life is standing there with my mom and dad and my coach looking at me and just sort of adoring me as it felt, right? And it's a beautiful moment and I wouldn't change it.
Right.
But there's a subtle message getting sent in that. When you just are just standing there, being there in the middle of the field, doing nothing.
No trophy.
We're not real interested in you. We're not real excited about you. But when you start to perform, when you start to do things, when you start to run, when you start to score, oh man, you've got our attention. And this is a huge moment for a kid. As an adult, that doesn't seem like a big deal, but you think about a kid is dependent upon the attention of their tribe for security and safety, right? So this is an existential moment for a kid. He's like, oh, when I run, everybody looks at me and I'm safe and I belong. And when I don't know where I'm going to end up, right? I don't know if I'm safe. So I think this is one of the ways that we learn that our worthiness is going to be contingent upon the things that we do.
Yeah, and talk about family of origin, where most of our most significant programming gets set, right? Like those are the most formative years for us forming beliefs about ourselves and how the world works. This is where our mental models really emerge. And some people will continue to live according to that program the rest of their life. We call it being asleep at the wheel of their own life, unconsciously living out of their subconscious program. Some of the research we've seen recently is, and I've been using this with my clients, we talk about how we think we're so much more elevated than animals, who most animals do everything they do by instinct, right? And we're supposed to have this ability to reason and be so much superior to that. And yet the research is showing we're only choosing our actions and behaviors about 5% of the time.
Wow.
We're acting out a program like 95% of the time. In your experience, how does that family, like the family of origin? I mean, we could go. I'd love to have a sidebar conversation with you about growing up with parents who loved me, but a dad that was a workaholic and didn't see much and wasn't very present in my life, and a mom who was borderline narcissistic, if not right over the line, and not getting that nurturing and the shame journey that sent me on. But how impactful are those formative years from your perspective, and what does it take to start to unravel some of that mess?
Well, to your point, what we're discovering is that reason isn't what distinguishes us from other mammals. It's actually awareness that distinguishes us from other mammals. That's the uniquely human capacity. And so part of the healing from shame involves an expansion of a gradual expansion of our awareness, to incorporate parts of ourselves and our experience that we've sort of pushed out of awareness because they're painful, because they hurt. So we bring them into awareness. We learn how to be soft and tender towards those things because it's the only way to keep it in awareness. If you judge it, you'll push it right back out. And then we learn how to love it enough to start to be vulnerable about it with people and share it with people. And as soon as we share it, I feel like then it's integrated into our sense of self. It's no longer in danger of being pushed out into our shadow. Now our awareness and our sense of self is expanded. I mean, what I'd want to emphasize for anybody listening, because any parent listening right now is like, oh no, like how am I shaming my kids?
Right.
What am I,
right.
And am I shaming my kids? The answer is yes, you're definitely shaming your kids. I mean, my 20-year-old is coming home today, right? He is far more precocious than his old man. He's already started counseling. And
wow.
One of the things he's starting to uncover is that if there was one thing that it was difficult for me to accept about him, it was his ADHD and all the ways that expressed itself. I'm a high executive functioning, organized, and that he carries that around with him now, the disapproval of the ways that he forgets things, of the ways that things aren't organized. And he walks around with some sense of, I'm not good enough. My mind isn't good enough in that way. And in a large part, I mean, his teachers helped with that too. I think he had 180 office referrals in his high school career, but he, his old man helped with it too. And so, part of the way that we can sort of serve our kids and become a safe family of origin is to not have shame about the ways we've shamed our kids. Ironically, if we have shame about it, we're going to have to push away their story and their truth, right? But when he comes home today and he's like, I've become aware of some more things, it's my job to be unashamed enough of my the things I wish I could change to be an open and receiving space for him. And so as parents, that's what we can do, is we can deal with our shame so that we can receive our kids when they're starting to wrestle with theirs.
The healing that comes from, to your point as the parent, and I think of I recently got married. Wendy and I got married, and we had the family over. My girls who are older, 31 and 26, and then her girls were there. And on a couple of nights before the wedding, we're all kind of just hanging out and enjoying some cigars with my daughters, which is a pastime that I get to do once or twice a year, and really a favorite time. But I was able to, and it just it lended to the moment where I had this very vulnerable moment of recognizing that when they were younger, when they were 6, 7, 10, I was so busy and focused on, at that time in the church world as a minister, that I had no time for them, that God came first, right? The church came second, and then, the family somewhere fit into whatever spare time I had. And I wasn't fully present for them. And I remember saying to them how I carry shame and guilt and all of that for how I was then. And I made the statement to them, I can't go back and change the past. All I can ask for is for your forgiveness for how I showed up and a commitment to how I will show up moving forward. And it really is, it's fresh. So it's still very defining for me, but an incredibly defining moment for me and for them. It was very powerfully received by everyone. Just this notion of, just to your point of just stepping forward with that and recognizing and bringing that healing.
So many parents are concerned with doing all of the right things as they're raising their kids, so their kids will still want to be in a relationship when they grow older. But my message to parents is, you can get it all wrong as long as when they tell you that, you're willing to receive it.
Yeah.
And then you have a deepening relationship with your adult children. And so just do the inner work to get ready to be told you messed up some things, and then you'll be okay with your kids, right?
Let's talk about the inner work. You used 2 words earlier that I know that for some of our listeners, you said we have to get soft and tender about it. And again, men are not allowed to be soft and tender in our culture. One of the other archetypes we have yet to explore is the live action hero, right? Men, you're not supposed to let them see you sweat. If you get hurt, just rub some dirt on it. You don't look at explosions, right? In the movies, they always walk away from them and don't even flinch when the explosion's happening behind them, right?
That's how I am whenever I have an explosion.
Right? you always get the girl. Things always work out for you. You're almost bulletproof, right? Like, this is one of the alpha male. Like, you have to look and sound and be a certain way. And let's face it, it's an unrealistic view of life in general. But it's been so celebrated in Hollywood and in popular culture that I know that a lot of the men that I talk to, one of the tools we love to use is the feeling wheel to help men start to articulate what they're feeling beyond good or bad. Let's get a little more specific, guys, right? And their usual response to it when I first pull it out is they kind of look at me sideways, like, what the fuck is this? Like, pardon the French, but they're like, what are you about to pull on me, Deschamps? And yet, as soon as you start exploring it with them, all of a sudden, it's like they need permission. But how do you, in your work over the years and in your ongoing work now, how do you help men break through that barrier that it actually takes tremendous strength and courage to be soft and tender?
I have a few thoughts.
Good.
The first one is I want to clarify that it's not just men sending men the message of toxic masculinity, right, that implicitly gets communicated between the sexes as well. Here's an example. My Goodreads reviews of The Unhiding of Elijah Campbell. Now, of course, as an author, I would never look at my own Goodreads reviews. So this is just stories people have told me.
Others have told you what they said.
Yes, yeah, these sort of helpful others, right? Telling me every time a new review shows up. But if you look at them, what you see is that so Elijah is not a traditionally male protagonist. Right. He is vulnerable. He does have weakness. He is wrestling with his pain. And when you look at it by gender, the reviews from women are, we just don't really like this protagonist. He's weak. He's just not something we want to get on board with. And when you look at the most positive reviews, it's from men going, finally, a protagonist I can resonate with. Right. Wow. And so I think we get a lot of pressure from women too. I mean, Brene Brown tells the great story about the guy who walks up to her at her book signing table and says, I noticed you never talk about men's shame. And she's like, well, and he says, you know why? I think I know why. See those 2 women over there, my wife and daughter buying your book? They'd rather me die on my white horse than fall off of it. Right. Oh. And so Brene Brown started to talk about the ways that women source their strength from their men's invulnerability, and that a woman's job is to learn how to source her sense of strength from herself so she can allow her man to be vulnerable. Right.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's some stuff in that.
Oh, there's a little bit of stuff in that. Yeah. There's 6 episodes in that.
Yeah. You're going to have to become a regular guest now just so we can unpack just that part of it.
Yeah, we can have another episode about that. But your question is about softness and tenderness and the role of that in dealing with our shame as men and as women. And I think one of the ways that, so even when I wrote Loveable, I talked about the voice of shame within us and the voice of grace. And the message of Loveable was to let the voice of shame quiet down and to listen for the voice of grace, right? And in the 7 years since I published Loveable, I would say what shifted the most for me is I would say, don't even just let the voice of shame quiet down. Soften to the voice of shame. Learn how to embrace the voice of shame. Because guess what the voice of shame is? That's your inner child too. Most of us develop that voice of shame between the ages of about 4 to 8. This is sort of what we see generally. That's when that inner critic starts to kick in. So if we're 47 now, like I am, and my inner critic shows up like it did this week, as it sometimes does.
Yes.
If my response is is the traditionally masculine response of I've got to fix that, I got to get rid of that, I got to overcome that, I've got to shift my mindset, all these sort of things that we do as men, we're literally re-rejecting our inner child. We're saying, hey, the shameful part of my younger experience, that's inconvenient to me right now. I should be over it. But the wound of shame in the first place was one of rejection. So now we are re-traumatizing that younger part of us. So now for me, when that voice of shame shows up, my job is to soften to it and to create a space for it. You know, this week it was, the fountains need to be cleaned. Oh, the thing you sent to your agent wasn't perfect enough. Oh, you should have gone this direction with this client. They're going to fire you. And it was like, instead of being like, why am I regressing into an inner critic mindset? It was like, oh, there's like my 6-year-old self again, holding the trophy, going, you got to be just right for everybody to be happy with you. And it's like, no, dude, you can put the trophy down and just be yourself, and that's going to be enough. I promise. And that's the softening to the shame I'm talking about.
Right.
What would you say to the guy who hears you say that and says, here's what you need to do, and the response is, how? Like what's the starting point to begin to unhide?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about my book, OpenHearted. So I fielded that questions for years, honestly, and I didn't quite know how to answer it. But OpenHearted is my answer to that question, which is that there is a moment that repeats itself over and over again in our lives, most commonly in our relationships, and it's the moment that our heart closes. It's the moment that something is said or something is done or whatever, and we can just feel that tightening somewhere between our waist and our temples, and we can feel our heart close to and start to resist that moment. That's a moment where usually separation, disconnection, and conflict starts. And we can actually mine that moment for a deeper understanding of our history, our wounds, our pain, and how we can reconnect with important parts of ourselves, because it's all right there in that moment.
Right.
And when you talk to couples, this is what they say is like, we only have basically one fight, but we have it over and over again. And
Right.
It's like, okay, so you have a wounded inner child is showing up in this moment, and you have a wounded inner child is showing up in this moment, and they're both calling for protection in that moment. So you close your hearts to each other. What would it look like to open your hearts to each other and to yourselves and start to get more reacquainted with that part of you? So that's the very first, in terms of the how, the mechanics of that is we have 5 senses, right? What are they? Hearing, taste, touch, smell, all those things. If you only use your 5 senses, you will be in a closed heart and in disconnection and conflict before you know it, because you're relying upon things breaking bad out here in order to recognize that you're about to close. If you can draw upon your 6th sense, which we call interoception, which is the capacity to tune into your body, you're going to get significantly more warning that your heart's about to close, and you're going to have more capacity to choose and to work with that moment. And so you start to tune in. So like when I say, hey, how bad you got to go to the bathroom, right? And you're like, oh man, I guess in the next 20 minutes, that's interoception. You're actually going in, tuning into your body, coming back out and reporting. You can do the same thing to notice your heart closing. And there's data, which this isn't probably the interview for that, but there's data that suggests you'll get 80% more warning that your heart's about to close, and that you can actually start to work with that moment to soften to what is needing protection in you and to open your heart to the person in front of you.
Wow. That's powerful. Again, paying attention to what's going on underneath the hood, right? Like what's happening in my heart, what's happening in my body, and looking for those signs. I mean, a place where shame, I mean, the relationship with self is one of the most important relationships because it sets the tone for every other relationship in your life. But shame, it's insidious, not only in one's own life, but it really becomes a resistor in our relationships, whether it be with spouses, children, friends. What's been your experience there? And again, how does one begin to shift that?
Here, I'm looking up. You just made me think of something. Yeah, here it is. So we had friends over last Saturday, and we just closed on a little bit of property near our house that sort of allows us to sort of be surrounded on all sides by forest rather than homes. And we're walking down the street and looking at what we just purchased, and he looked at me and he said, "Man, you're turning into the king of the neighborhood." And a lot of uncomfortable things happened inside of me when he said that. And I had to in order to manage everything that was uncomfortable, I had to go inward. And I texted him the next day and I said, yesterday when we were in the street looking at the property across the street, you said I'm becoming the king of the neighborhood. The inner chatter that went along with that was very uncomfortable. I am the king of the neighborhood. I love being the king of the neighborhood. It feels good to be recognized as the king of the neighborhood. My God, how insecure am I that I need to be the king of the neighborhood? How arrogant I am to enjoy being called that. I hope he didn't see how much I enjoyed that. He'll think I'm arrogant and then he won't like me anymore. I better be humble right now. Oh, but I bet he can see through my humility. He isn't going to like me anymore. All that was happening in the moment. And then I said, before the work I've done, that would have ruined my evening. I'd have gotten all caught up in the chatter and consumed with leaving a better impression. For a while, I thought the work would result in all that going away. Now I'm starting to realize that it will never go away, and that wishing it would go away isn't freedom because you're caught in a battle with it. Freedom is being aware of it without being in it, locating my sense of self in the part of me that can watch it and laugh at it and move on with the evening. In part, because in my humanity, it's all true. A part of me does want to be king, and a part of me is terrified people will know that. Now I've said it on a podcast. However, in my awareness or soulfulness or whatever you want to call it, I can embrace that very normal human part of me as a part of me, but not the definer of me. And what I would love, is for my awareness to come all the way forward, and my self-acceptance to come all the way forward so that I could be standing there in the street with him and be like, oh, hey, dude, guess what just happened in my head?
Right.
Yeah.
Right there in the spot. It took me probably 15 to 30 minutes to sort of get back to that place of being able to soften to it and laugh at it rather than trying to get rid of it. Yeah, I'd love to get those 30 minutes back.
Right.
But vulnerability for me was just reaching out to him the next day and being able to share that with him and have a great conversation.
No, that's so powerful. One of the areas that shame really shows up for me still, where the voice of shame, I hear it regularly, and I'm making progress, but sometimes it feels like really slow, is with my kids. Right. Again, I could relate to what you said earlier, Rob. Again, we both come from that pastoral background where, like living the sacrificial life, crucifying the self, death to self, all that language meant that any acknowledgement of self was almost, it was like the ultimate sin almost, right? And it led to some really unhealthy thinking and beliefs, which led to, in many ways, I love my kids, I showed up for them, but not the way I would have liked to. And even in adult conversations now, my eldest daughter got married last October. My second daughter gets married in August in the south of France. My son just started university, right? So they're all grown up now. And yet sometimes when I'm around them, I struggle to be in the moment because I will perceive something, hear something that triggers that old script of you fucked up, you made mistakes, right? They're just tolerating you right now because you're their dad. And more recently, being able to, in the moment, push through that and like get present to push through it, and then just, yep, that's behind me now. I'm showing up differently and being able to enjoy the moment. But there's still some of those moments where that I'm still like trapped in, it seems like, thinking from decades ago that still shows up so strong and so prevalent. I feel like a little kid at the table.
And part of the like, that was the power of that conversation I had last week, the Sunday night conversation I had with my girls, was because I basically, everything that you just said, I said out loud to them, and it wasn't a surprise to them. Now, I knew this wasn't the first and only conversation we had around it, but in a sense, I was now, that vulnerability that you talk about, Kelly, with your friend, that was the vulnerability. I was putting it out there literally 2 days before this big day of saying, I screwed up. And sometimes I sit and I'm looking at you two, and I'm fearful that you're just looking at what I'm doing in my life now thinking, yeah, but where were you then? And to be that vulnerable with your own kids, to say, here's what goes through my mind in these moments. And then to have them to receive that the way they did, because I had no idea how they were going to receive that. You had no idea how your friend would receive that vulnerability, right? That's the freedom that comes out of it.
Yes. Yeah. And I think like you said you feel like a little kid at the table, right? I think whenever we get that feeling of feeling like a little kid at the table, or I'm not acting my age, or, whatever, it's an opportunity just to stop and say, yeah, the past is pushing its way into the present in the form of a younger part of me that's sort of frozen in time. And one of the most helpful things to me has been to remember that our inner child doesn't ever grow up. Like it is frozen in time. It is always going to be experiencing the same thoughts and feelings. The job is not to get our inner child to sort of have a different set of thoughts. It's to be able to hold space for them when they show up, and to be tender to them when they show up. And so more and more to me, it doesn't feel like self-acceptance is the end, is the getting rid of self-rejection. It's the self-acceptance is self-acceptance and self-rejection coming together in the very same moment, where it's like, oh, there's all my self-rejection. Oh, I love that part of me that doesn't believe in himself. Like he needs that love more than anybody. Like, okay, wow. Here we are.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, the way you frame that, like earlier it was, it's you're showing up as too much, right? Not enough or too much. And now saying it's not about, because I've talked about my inner critic. I grew up with a very severe inner critic, and only recently have I come to recognize through the ongoing work that when I refer to myself internally by my last name, so when I Deschamps myself, my last name's Deschamps. So when I go Deschamps, nothing good follows. Right? Like when I'm being kind to myself, I will use my first name, Eric. Right? But the idea that it's not about trying to eradicate that. Because I think that's been my goal, has been like
to fire your inner critic.
Well, I talk about firing my inner critic, right? Like, and I say, and yet the son of a bitch keeps trying to show up for work every day.
I've never met any, and I mean, you talk to any, they've never been able to actually get rid of their inner critic. Right. We certainly can make progress in terms of how it shows up and how we handle it. But like, I remember listening to Krista Tippett interviewing the Dalai Lama. And she was like, oh, he'd said a few things. And she's like, oh, I just wish I could follow you around for a day and soak up your peace. And he just started laughing. He said, well, if you followed me around for a whole day, you'd also have to soak up my anger. And like he's just like, you're never going to get rid of it. You have to, you just simply have to tenderize to it. You have to accept it. You have to even learn. I mean, I think the most enlightened people I know, they're able to laugh with it. Yeah. They're able to sort of get a kick out of it. Like it's like, yeah, my inner critic's always going to be there, and eventually I'll be able to get a kick out of it. Like, wouldn't that be amazing? I'm not there yet, but yeah, I'd love to get there.
I can almost envision the inner critics getting pissed off because you're loving on the inner critic. And stop loving on me. Stop laughing at me.
You have just hit on it. Just hit on it. When you are trying to totally eliminate the inner critic, you're eliminating with the inner critic, and therefore you're strengthening it, which is why you can't ever get rid of it.
Well, the old saying, the old adage, right? What you resist persists.
That's it.
And we talk about acceptance. I mean, I'm having some, but like the Dalai Lama, like, can we just, I remember holding myself to some pretty high, I still, this is something I'm still working on, but holding myself to some pretty unrealistic expectations. And my coach, Sherry, she's from the South, so she has a bit of an accent. Right.
Don't do that.
And she'll tell me, she'll say, Eric, are your expectations in line with reality? And every time she does that, I just want to tell her to go take a hike, right? But holding myself to these just unreal. And I remember I had read a book by the Dalai Lama and his level of compassion, even for his persecutors. And of course, I turned, my older self would immediately turn an awareness of something I might want to lean into and become more of, but I would turn it into ammunition against myself, that I'm less than, that here's another area that I'm failing in. She was one day said, okay, can we talk about the Dalai Lama? She goes, so he's not married, he doesn't have kids, he lives on a mountaintop somewhere, and people do everything for him.
That's right. And by his own admission, he still gets annoyed and frustrated with life. Like, what chance do any of us stand?
Right, exactly. So this whole notion, again, I think the biggest takeaway for me so far in this conversation is that radical self-acceptance means even accepting the voice of shame, accepting the inner critic, making peace with him, and learning to coexist in a way that's healthy, as opposed to trying to eradicate it completely from my life. So that's a game changer for me. And I don't know. It's going to take me days to unpack that one.
Well, and if it helps, another way of thinking about shame we didn't talk about is you could think of shame as your inner child's first attempt to take back some control. So what happened was that as a kid, we started to experience pain, usually the pain of some sort of separation, whether it was judgment or punishment or criticism or loneliness, abandonment, neglect, unseen, misunderstood, all the things. They're all some form of separation pain. And what we did as kids is we went, what's the problem here? How can I fix this? If I'm the problem, maybe I can fix this. If I'm the cause of separation because I'm bad or I'm not good enough. So we sort of participate in formulating our shame beliefs as well, as a way to sort of get some control back. And so like to be able to sort of encounter that voice of shame and be like, hey dude, that's like, I get it. I get why you decided that you were bad. And if you could fix you, everything would be okay and you'd never be alone. But like, that wasn't the real reason that you were feeling those things. You're feeling those things because you're human and everybody's confused and thinking that we're all separate. And that was just normal stuff and sometimes abnormally painful stuff. And so, hey, like, let's just not get into that control game by trying to pretend it's up to us to fix.
Wow. So you've done a lot of this work. You've written a lot about this topic. I know that both men and women listening to this episode can resonate with probably already everything that's been said, because the voice of shame doesn't just show up for men. We're just focused primarily in your work with men specifically. When the voice of shame speaks to a man, what is it saying? What are its central themes?
You are not okay the way you are. And so you need to do more to be okay and to be acceptable to people. I mean, I think the hard thing for a man is that we are taught that we should be okay being independent, okay not being we shouldn't have any needs, we shouldn't have any relational wants, we should just be okay and self-sufficient. But men, again, are human beings who are wired for connection, who are wired for longing for belonging, right? And so we're caught up in this thing where we're told, no, you shouldn't want to secure relationships with other people because you should be fine on your own. And yet everything in us is wired to be in relationships with other people. So in the background, we're constantly going, how am I going to secure my relationships? I got to be okay, but I'm not okay. So I got to do more to be okay. And And so the first thing we can do is to sort of accept that relationships matter to us. In fact, they're probably the most important thing to us. And everything we do and everything we've been told about how relationships don't or shouldn't matter to us is a lot of baloney.
Mm-hmm.
If your human relationships matter.
We talk a lot on the podcast and in the Living Richly Nation, the importance of community, the importance of relationships, that while you can do some of the work on your own, a lot of this work you need to surround yourself with people. We're all big proponents of a therapist, having somebody who you can unpack some of this with.
Yeah.
But the power of community. What would you say to a guy who says, I'm ready to do this work. I'm starting to have these conversations with myself. But how do I there's no way in hell I'll ever bring this subject up to my buddies, right? Like there's no way, like I would be the laughing stock. But what would you say to a guy who's sitting there going, how do I embrace a community to live out this, to begin to deal with some of these things when they're ready to do that? What would you say as advice to that?
Well, I would say increasingly there are communities that exist to support a man like that. I'd say go listen to the Living Richly podcast. Start there. Yeah, I tell you, I had an experience. After I published Loveable, I was asked to speak to a group at a conference in the Florida Keys. It was October of 2018. It's a group called Front Row Dads. And tagline is family men with businesses, not businessmen with families. They asked me to come speak about Loveable. I was attending the event for a day before I actually spoke. And 6 hours into that first day, I'm like, here they all are. Here's all the guys like me who have big hearts, have hearts for their families, who want to take responsibility for their own inner work in order to show up better for their people, who are willing to. I once had a guy say to me after a talk I gave, I realize now that I used to think a man was someone who was afraid of nothing around them. Now I think a man is somebody who's afraid of nothing within them. Right. And here were these guys, like they weren't afraid of anything within them. They were going to face anything they needed to become better men, better husbands, better fathers. And I thought, man, here's my guys. So there's a community like Front Row Dads out there that I now belong to, and we're not alone. Increasingly, there's communities of men who want to do the inner work to show up as more whole human beings.
Yeah, it often just takes someone going first. In our work, again, we work with primarily in our coaching business leaders, business owners, very successful people. And it's amazing when you get them into a one-to-one conversation, how open they will become when they feel safe and they feel like they won't be judged. We heard a great story recently. I was invited to speak for an online event, a new monthly. They were launching a new men's group in Owen Sound, which is in Northern Ontario in our province. And I was invited to speak, be the presenter for that particular inaugural event. It was only at the end of the show, of the webinar, that I found out that it was because they listened to the podcast. The two founders had listened to the podcast, or one had listened, said, you need to listen to this. And then they said, what do you think? And they started this group for men as a result. And my heart just was just overwhelmed with it takes the courage to go first. And when you do, you give other men permission to break free from the nonsense of you need to have it all together, right?
There is another entrepreneurial group that I spend some time serving, and I know one of its leaders got up here in the last couple of years. He was given the keynote, and he got up as a room full of 250 uber successful men. And he said, we must be the most traumatized room full of men in the world because you don't get this successful unless you're running away from something.
Wow. Whoa.
Right.
Yeah.
And so now you have a room full of 250 men who are like, I'm going to have to figure out what I'm running away from in here. Now they're launched on the inner journey. And so you're right. Like it's leaders who embrace that if our community is going to become as whole and as healthy as we want it to be, we're going to have to start to face some of the stuff we're pushing away.
Right. It's elevating the conversation beyond, what is it? Business, blood sports,
boobs,
boobs and booze. Right?
Yep.
Like,
yeah, 4Bs. Never heard them before.
Right. 4Bs. Like, because I think that's what most guys, like, a lot of their relationships are really just around those four things. And listen, I'm passionate about business. I could talk business all day long with other entrepreneurs. But I think there's a lot of men that hide behind, to your point, when we feel shame and we're not enough, we need to do more. And I think that contributes. I know that a lot of men, I know from my own journey, I can't speak for all men, I know your journey, you shared it as well, that we felt like we were failing at home. Like we felt like we're not showing up really great. We're bad dads or bad husbands, but we feel like we're failing there. But when we put our hands and apply ourselves at business, that seems to work, right? And so we end up putting all of our eggs or most of our eggs in that basket, only to realize that we've been climbing the ladder that's been leaning on the wrong wall the whole time.
That's right.
Right.
You got it.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's so gratifying to take control and go out into the world and exert our wonderful capacity for control in achieving success in business. And then you go home and you try to exert the same level of control over the home, and nobody wants it. And you're like, well, what's the problem? Everybody loves me out there when I'm in control and making everything happen. And it must be you guys because everyone else loves me. And it's like, no, it's just like in intimate relationships, things have to be a little bit different than in business.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Kelly, this has been amazing. One last question before we wrap up for today. And thank you so much for being on the show again. But for the men that are listening, the men and women that are listening to this episode, if you could take all the wisdom of all your books, right, and in a short, succinct word of encouragement for them to take that next step and break free from the voice of shame, embracing it but breaking free from its insidious grip, what would you say to them?
I would say if you can't welcome it, you can't work with it. So if you're in a position of pushing anything away or rejecting it, it has you. I would say soften to everything that you see in you. There's really no benefit of not softening to anything that you see in you. And that the way to freedom isn't, fixing anything, but just learning how to feel things and being open-hearted to yourself and your people in your life. And so head down that path, and I promise it's got a really good destination at the end of it, or along the way. I don't know where the end is.
Yeah, that's so good. Kelly, you are the king of podcast guests.
Oh, that's so kind of you.
Oh wait, what's the chatter? Let's plug a speaker to his brain. Let's listen to that chatter right now.
Do you have a trophy for me right now?
There most will be improved podcast guest.
No,
that's right. Yes, that's it.
No, you rocked it the first time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is just over the top. Yep.
No, thank you so much for being a part of things. We're gonna have for our listeners, we'll have links to all of Kelly's books, to his website, so that you can find that. All of that will be found in the show notes for the episode where he comes out. Thank you again. We really will reach out and want to have you back on. It's just been such a pleasure. Both times having these conversations have been so tremendous, and so thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. You both know as speakers that you can talk about one thing to one audience and then another and get totally different reactions. So you're only as good as your audience. You guys are amazing. Not that you're an audience, but I really am grateful for this space that you created, and I'll come back to it as many times as you want me to.
Amazing.
And we're grateful for all of you that have tuned in, continuing to listen each and every week to this podcast, and for really showing the support. We want to encourage you to like, to leave your comments, your thoughts. What was one of those mind-blowing moments for you from today's episode? And certainly if there's someone that you feel would really benefit from hearing this episode, to share that out to them. Want to encourage you to visit our website, livingrichley.me. All kinds of resources that are found on the website, including links to our community, our Living Richly Nation Facebook group. But also, most importantly, we're so excited about the 15-day life vision challenge, and the reviews and the response from that has been so tremendous. Absolutely free resource to help you figure out your life manifesto. I want to encourage you to check that out. You can find it at the website. Thanks again for being a part of our episode today, and just get out there and live your best life.